accept.
You may as well.
You can give your name first.
Now, I'm Herbert Keil, a member of a family, early settlers in the Hollands Grove area, and of course, part of Washington. I have been told to follow the outline of my life, and when any event occurred of a particular notice, I should include it. I am new at this procedure, and I trust you will bear with me. Is that about the speed, or it doesn't matter?
Let's see. Okay.
Start over and go on.
Go on.
Now, in entering to a consideration of my life, one of the first places to start would be the marriage of my parents. So we'll go back to a beautiful spring morning when the Reverend Brothagi of St. John's German Lutheran Church came out to the west edge of Washington to the Esser home, where he was to officiate at the marriage of Emily Esser and Jacob Hess Jr. This done, he was to go west to Fond du Lac Township, where another wedding was to take place, that of Katie Metty, daughter of the Conrad Mettys, and Daniel Keil. A delay occurred because it was evident that the pastor had ripped or torn his trousers. The ladies at the Esser home were up to the situation, and they mended the garment. Whether they mended it on or off, I wasn't informed, but it was mended. And the Metty-Keil marriage took place. Now that's too much pause. Now in the due course of time, I arrived on the scene, followed by a sister, Mary, and a brother, Lester. in the farm home. And the big thing to look forward to in my young life was school. Hopewell School, which I was to attend, was situated a mile east of our home. And the teacher was Frank Swally, a graduate of a normal school in Pennsylvania, and what we would call a smart cookie. He was an adept at mental arithmetic, and the school had 65 pupils, all 8 grades, and one teacher. I was led to school when I began by a 12-year-old neighbor's boy. And when I got there, I was put into the third reader. My mother taught me to some extent at home, and I was able to read in that on that level. So there's where I started. Now the seats at that day were double seats, and the one I occupied was in company with a lad from Peoria, Ed Novak, who was living with the Fries family and helping with the chores. We had gouged a line down the middle of the desk to tell which territory belonged to who. And anybody's property that got across that line took a quick ride out into the aisles. This went on, I don't know why it wasn't interrupted, until one day, now Ed was in the third reader, I in the fourth, so he recited first. With this reading, there were some words to spell, and among them was the word coat. He was asked to spell coat, and he complied by C-O-O-T. Wrong. Spell it again. C-O-O-T. And he giggled. Well, that giggle was a cue. And Mr. Swally ripped from behind his desk a 6-foot hedge switch, which he sought to apply. The boy, of course, did his best to keep out of the way from it. The pupils who were seated could keep out of harm's way by ducking under the desk. Of course, as the story goes, the stovepipe was hit, but it was made for that kind of stuff. The coal bucket was upset, and in the course of the excitement, Novak absorbed quite a few welts. So many that some of the Fries family came to protest at treating the boy so that he was incapacitated for some of his chores. Milk stools, for instance, didn't come with cushions. Well, school progressed, and I finally came to the 8th reader, and time for the 8th grade examination, which was the stepping stone to entering high school. To take this examination, Mr. Swally and I went to Morton, to the high school there. Now, of course, we planned to go by horse and buggy, the only conveyance for that day. Now, Mr. Swally's road horse had a colt, so she couldn't be too far from home. So we took Old Pet, a horse of my father's. She was a good traveler, but blind, so needed very careful guidance. In the morning we left, it was a beautiful spring morning. But when we came back, a snowstorm was in progress. The wind coming from the north, in which direction we had to travel. Both of us had neglected to bring any gloves, so we had to change driving. And it came to be almost too much against that wind. So Mr. Swally stopped at the Charles Wagner farm, midway between Morton and Washington. He knew the folks. He went in and borrowed a pair of gloves from Mrs. Wagner, so we were able to continue and reached Washington. I passed this 8th grade examination, and my mother, it happens, had a high regard for education and had decided that I was going to go out and get some of that wonderful commodity and bring it home. So I was entered on the roll in Washington High School. About you. Performance. Thank you, cheer me up. The high school had single desks and was overpopulated. So another boy and I occupied one seat. And the character behind us used the opportunity whenever possible to reach ahead and bump our heads together. He outsized me somewhat, and my seat mate wasn't willing to involve himself, so we had to endure it. Now, it happens, I don't know why, that the principal, a man by the name of like to me, and in fact, on 2 occasions promised to beat the hell out of me unless I changed my style of behavior. Now it happens that while going to Hopewell School, one rainy March evening, the youngsters from the west were tramping home through the mud when along came a neighbor, team and large spring wagon. He allowed all the other youngsters to board, but kept me off with a buggy whip. This aroused somewhere in me, and I made a resolution that when I reached my size, that I was going to beat him up. I was denied that satisfaction because before that time came, he went wading in the Illinois River and slipped into hole on the river floor and was drowned. Now, I didn't feel that I could apply this to the principal. He was bigger than I expected to be and was somewhat of an athlete, not slow or awkward. The superintendent, though, by the name of Webster, E.E. Webster, both he and his family were very as were most of the rest of the pupils. I was not, I hasten to admit, possessed of too many of the social graces that people appreciate.
You can go back.
I must here tell the story of the glass marble. One period when a young woman, young lady, was in charge of the study hall, 22 boys present. She was an excellent teacher, but no disciplinarian. And somebody brought a glass marble to school, almost the size of a baseball. And the boys amused themselves by pitching it back and forth. On several occasions, it came very close to my head, and I became convinced that there was a plot to take me out of the. Now there's this guy.
No, you can stop.
And when the next time the marble came close to me, I reached out, grabbed it, leaned down into the aisle, and heaved it as hard as I could to the front of the room. It hit the low platform, bounced into the air about 10 feet, and lit on the desk in front of the teacher, and rolled away into the floor. She quickly ran and secured it, and just at that time, Mr. Webster, whose nickname was Foxy, appeared in the doorway, and immediately the silence of death prevailed, because no boy fooled around with him. He pocketed the marble, which the teacher gave him, and she told him about what had been occurring, and he turned and glared at those 22 boys. Then, picking out one Robert Stormer, who, while a good kid, was blamed for everything, got into the seat in front of him, and took Robert, the unfortunate, by the ears, raised him up so that till they were eye to eye, and asked him, "Did you throw that marble?" "No, sir." "Do you know who threw that marble?" "No, sir." Good old Bob. And in that way, he went on with a third degree, and to every boy in that room, excepting me. When I told that story to my children, I said, kids, remember the value of a good reputation. Well, I stayed with it, and having decided, as about the only opportunity I had to earn some money, to teach in the public schools. For that, I had to take a teacher's examination for a certificate, which I passed the first trial. And in so doing, got the attention of the then County Superintendent of Schools, Ben L. Smith, who noted that I had needed only one examination, and he admired the neat, concise way that I had answered the many questions. The first year, I got a job teaching in the 4 lower grades of Hopewell School, my home district. You can imagine that discipline wasn't of a high order, with 65 pupils, 8 grades, 1 teacher, before I came. And there was one youngster in particular that made a success of aggravating me. I waited until he committed an offense of some gravity, kept him after school, and administered a spanking, using as paddle my rather broad hand. His parents didn't appreciate, especially not the severity of the punishment. His father even broadcast the fact that he was coming over to school and teach that young teacher something. I worried a little, but the man who taught the upper 8 grades consoled me by saying that he'd stand behind me. And he opened the drawer in his desk, and made and put in view a hammer, a claw hammer. I was certain that the 2 of us would be sufficient, but with a claw hammer beside us, I knew we would prevail. Now, school went on, the boy continued to attend, and after a field day or picnic, I don't know which, I was home in the barnyard at the chores when I noticed a very tired boy running up the road. I called to him and found that he was lost. Well, what was I to do but to take him to his home, which lay about a mile south on what we call the Peoria Road. So we started, and halfway on the road there was a high bluff, and the boy in his tired condition was unable to make it. So I got him onto my back and brought him up the hill. Took him a little ways further where we could see his home. Got him to admit that he recognized it and would go there, which he did. I stayed and saw that he accomplished that fact. That made an entirely different feeling on the part of his family. They forgave me and maybe even admitted, though I didn't hear it, that perhaps he needed some chastising. So we were friends, which I appreciated. In that 4-year beginners class, another year in the upper 4 grades, 1 year in the Groveland upper 4 years, when I was offered the job of assistant superintendent, county superintendent of schools. No authority, it was just an office boy's job. I audited the treasurer's account, the township treasurer's account, made up the examination questions for the 7th and 8th grade, and conducted the teachers' examinations. I made only 2 blunders, which were forgiven, and we went on. Now I was in line for draft into the Army. And Mr. August Heipel, who was secretary of the draft board, told me that there was a draft coming to send 1 man from each county to a technical school in Chicago. He felt it might promise something. Of course, it was just an old Army gimmick to get a group together, give them a little training, and have them ready when they needed a group to fill in some certain spot. But anyway, I went, and I entered the Army. With 67 others, was sent to Camp Meade in Maryland. Now, just a sideline on how these things work. We had a man drafted who didn't want to go overseas. And he, like the rest of us, learned that they weren't sending anyone overseas that had any venereal disease. So he, poor fish, went out one night on the street, and as I was told it was easy to do, gave himself an inoculation which led to him having a good dose of syphilis. Now the 67, why was it 67? There were 102 counties in Illinois. Cook County was excused from this draft because they had sent a large contingent before. And one man had shot himself in the foot. So we're taking the F4s out, we had 67. The 4 Fs were sent as home guards to Washington, D.C. We spent 6 weeks in Camp Meade, and then were marched to the train on our way to shipboard. We rode through the part of Philadelphia, missed Washington, D.C., and went again through Baltimore. I was glad when my goodbyes were far behind me, because at all the crossings where the train stopped,
1, 2.
we got to the boat shed. We were marched downhill in a cobble paved street. There were many of the families of the Philadelphia boys there. One young woman, seeing her friend in the group leaving maybe forever, ran from behind the line of policemen onto that cobble-paved hill, slipped and fell full length, which we were locked in the boat shed, no postcards even out, and when it became dark, we got on the ship, the Masaba, a former packet ship. Her last ship, though, she carried a cargo of horses. The sailors told us that 58 had been tied on the deck. They ran into a winter storm. The waves came over the ship and washed the horses overboard. One thing, aside from one thing, we made the trip safely, had several submarine scares, and one thing I want to bring out. Don't make any comment as to what you're going to do in the future, unless, as was common, add, if the Lord is willing. Just this incident I want to bring up. We had a man on board, a big, healthy young fella, probably never sick a day in his life, who, I was told, often stated that, oh, I think I'll make it back if anybody will. Now, we were told, and it seems cruel, we were told, don't expect to come back. And before we left, we were treated to a sermon by an Italian Catholic priest. And his subject was prepare to meet thy God. And he certainly laid it on. Well, now it happened that the hatch cover from the open deck down to the first deck was made of 4x4s joined by 1x4s. And it was weakened by cutting a hole in one corner for a stairway to get between decks. Now, just as this man was coming up the stairway, the hatch cover overloaded because it was the only place, the hatch covers were the only place where the fellows could loaf, gave way. A corner of the 4x4 hit him in the temple and killed him instantly. That meant we had a burial at sea the next morning. Now, burial at sea is a very solemn occasion. I had a good viewing place and followed it carefully. After a religious service, and after the flag had been rolled up, the body had been positioned on a wide board, the one end on the rail of the ship. The end opposite the rail was lifted, and the body, which was enclosed in the canvas sack with iron in the bottom, slid off into the cold, dark waters of the North Atlantic. Now, it didn't go right to the bottom, you may be surprised. It hit the water and splashed around the second time, and then dove for Davy Jones' locker to await the judgment day. Our ship which had left the line of the convoy, and by the convoy there were 2 lines of 11 each ships, and in front was a British cruiser. As soon as the body had entered the water, power was turned on, and we hurried to join the convoy and went on. After, as I said before, a few submarine scares. Remember one dark night, we were brought out on deck, fire. What in the hell did I hope. And facing the rail, we got to Liverpool, but couldn't get close to the docks. We anchored out and were taken in launches. I remember they had a band there playing for us when we climbed up on the wharf, playing It's a Long Way to Tipperary. And we marched 7 miles over some more cobbled streets to a rest camp where we spent the night. We had a little entertainment. The girls many of them nurse girls, in charge of a youngster, got our attention. I remember one calling out in regard to the policeman that kept them on their side of the street. She called out, "Can't you get out when he ain't looking?" Impossible, poor girl. But we marched away from there, took the train for Southampton, and went into a rest camp 7 miles from where our boat was waiting. Now this boat was a flat-bottomed Monas Queen of Douglas. And when it got out on the water, the waves tossed it like a chip. We talked later to people who crossed on an ocean vessel, and they didn't notice the waves at all. But we did. We celebrated by being seasick. The first night we marched down to the wharf. The sea was too rough, so we marched back. The next night we went on board. And when we got out into the channel, a wave hit that boat, and we could easily imagine that we had gotten a torpedo. But none of us moved. We were seasick, and what could we have done, even if it had been a torpedo? So we went on, got into Liverpool, marched through the streets, were decorating, we could see them ahead, decorating the place with flags, and in the poorer part of town, near the waterfront, they were lined up on both sides. "Goodbye, Sammy." One question we were often asked was, "Have you had any training?" No, we had no training. Oh, "Goodbye, Sammy. Most of you will never get back." Old Jerry, that's the German, he's a bad one. He got my Willie, or my Joe, or my Freddie. Oh, he's a bad one. Most of you will never get back. And that was that. Quite cheerful, but we were so depressed that anything more wouldn't have mattered, so we went on and landed at Le Havre. That's the seaport of Paris. And from there we could hear the cannon roar on the Western Front. After a day, we went to a town by the name of Latu, a country town below Tours, in the middle part of France. We were housed in pup tents in a cow pasture. We, the 312th Field Artillery, which we were going to be, were on one end of this cow pasture, and on the other end was the 351st field artillery, a Negro outfit. I remember being at one end of town in a porch or gallery with a balustrade around it of a church, a Catholic church. It was in one corner of a triangle. Saloons were on the two other triangles. Now I was surprised looking down into that triangular square, or plaza, I guess, and suddenly it was filled with Negro soldiers, just as if they had climbed out of a crack in the pavement. And I was told what had happened. A Negro and a white were playing some sort of game in one of the saloons, and the white accused the Negro of cheating and pulled a knife on him. The Negro knocked him down. So far, so good. But it didn't stop there. And they proceeded to kick the downed man to death, which would have happened if it kept on, because you realize what those hobnail boots were capable of. Of course, there were MPs there, but armed only with clubs, which didn't amount to anything against a young mob. But fortunately, there was a captain there carrying his service revolver, and he pulled it, and they were smart. The Negroes were smart enough not to walk into a gun. So a very bad situation was avoided. We were ordered to get back to camp on the double, which I did. There was a short cut through a patch of timber, but I didn't take it. I stayed on the open street. Incident that might be interesting, which was indicative of some of the things those early pioneers faced. My Uncle Albert had a nice black team. Owning a black team in those days was the equivalent to having a Buick today. Now, Uncle and Aunt Christina, with Louis Keil, John Essick, Philip Noon, took a bobsled to go to Peoria to spend New Year's Eve at the home of relatives. In going over in the morning, they crossed on the ice. Coming back late after seeing the New Year in, and perhaps made a little bit careless by the refreshments, decided to cross on the ice again. They got halfway across when the team and the front runners of the sled fell through the ice. The people were sitting in the box on the ice with the back runners. The one horse got her feet on the ice, but the weight of the other horse and the runner pulled her under, and which was quite a loss for Uncle at that time. But they had to walk then from the middle of the river and 4 miles out to their homes. And I would also like to add a little about Holmes Grove Cemetery. My kids have been after me for some time to make a tape, or to have a tape made with my knowledge of the cemetery on it. Now, the cemetery was organized, put into operation by the Hollands Grove Evan UB Church, later turned over to a board of trustees. And some things there a visitor will notice. In season, a peony of brilliant red blooms demands attention. Now they told me that a family by the name of Johnson, related to the Keils, had their covered wagon ready to start the next morning for Nebraska. In the night, a little girl, Rachel Johnson, about a year old, died, was buried, and somebody planted a peony bush on the grave. Now that, as long as I can remember, came forth with a wondrous array of red blossoms. You know, most of the peonies that we know of are white or a pale pink. This was a brilliant red long before they otherwise developed a red peony. Corner of the cemetery, away from the other graves, are two single graves. Visitors ask what they are. They are the graves of suicides who at an early day were not buried with other people. We have gotten, or that custom has been abandoned of late. The cemetery grew up to brush and brambles until about 15 years ago, when Hopewell Grange had a work day and the members cleaned up as best they could. Now, my parents took a great interest in the cemetery. My mother was a common thing in the summer for her to come down the road from her home east of us with a pail and a rake and a hoe and a scythe, and that's a sickle in season. And she was partial to the graves of young mothers. And she got some fertilizer from the farm that she carried down, and she saw that the graves were in good shape. And Father often spent days with a grubbing hoe killing the sprouts and the brush that had missed the former workers. A story that illustrates one of the disadvantages of life at that time concerns a young woman who was about to give birth to her first child. No prior, she was a woman. No complications were expected. No pre-examination was done. And the doctor who was called, Dr. Zinsser was called to attend, and he got out facing a situation where a normal birth was absolutely impossible. And there was nothing to do at that time and place except a few hours of agonizing till her heart gave way and she died. Now, you've heard of the rural telephone lines. Everybody knew what was going on. And when Doc's little sorrel team was seen coming up the road, my father went out. I tagged along behind, and he talked with Doc, who was our physician and a friend of the family. And while I couldn't understand all the details, yet I remember that I wondered why grown people didn't do things a little better. I remember that as Doc told about it, he cried. They say doctors have no heart. There was one who did. I've run into some, too, who haven't. Well, I was in the Army, remember. Things went on. And till finally, the end of the war, we came back on the good ship Virginian. Going over, it took us 19 days, coming back 12. And we declined the honor of having a parade in Philadelphia and came back, that is the Illinois boys, to Camp Grant where we were discharged. Now another story that isn't exactly in line. We, of course, were given $60 on being discharged. And they told us that when we got to Chicago to be careful. There were girls working the street who would lure suckers to some hidden place where they'd be knocked in the head, relieved of their valuables, and then the bodies thrown into the Chicago River. We knew about that. The same thing took place in France. Well, we didn't have so much money. Just think of it, $60. They didn't need as much. Money was worth more over there. And a number of bodies were found in some of the canals. So I was warned. And when I left Camp Grant, my train only left for Peoria at 4 o'clock. So I spent the time window shopping on Michigan Avenue. While I was at that, here a young woman dressed in red, which was typical, or yes, in place. And I noticed she had high-heeled shoes, walking rapidly, brushed against me, gave me the come hither look, and hurried on. I followed her. When she came to a cross street, she crossed, got a few steps in, stopped to look if I was coming. I was. She kept on going until she got down to some of those streets where the elevated, is, and the streets are dark. She turned in one of those and went off to the right. And I waited at the corner. And she got in a ways and she looked to see if I was coming. I waved goodbye and went back to window shopping. And oh yes, I forgot, and I want to tell you this. There were three of us. We got a pass to the French Alps. It's the town where Caterpillar has a plant.
Geneva?
That's up in Switzerland. Grenoble. All right. Now, when we came to Grenoble, my buddy and I, who were to have a room when we got to the place, near us or next to us, there was a team of a man named Wickham from Rockford, and now when we got to Grenoble, of course, there were girls waiting for us. And our young friend from rural Pennsylvania picked one, and that's the last we saw of him during that our stay there. Some of his friends, though, got a letter from him telling them that he'd been taken to a sort of prison hospital where the disorder that he had accumulated was taken care of. And he went home with us. He was cured, and the morning we were loading up in the steamer, he ran to join us. Happiest fellow that I've ever seen. One not so happy, I didn't see this, but they told me about it, was a Negro who split his mess sergeant's head with a cleaver and was hung before we left. When we started back to join our outfit, we left, and instead of taking the route we were supposed to, we went AWOL and got on the Paris Express for Paris. And they let us in, fine, come on boys, fine. We thought we'd walk out just about as easily. No. We went the first night to military police headquarters in Rue Sainte-Anne. And I remember we were taken before an officer and interrogated. And I was elected spokesman or liar. Those fellows knew better, of course. They had gone through this before. And they took us, altogether there were 55 that were picked up that day and taken to the Bastille in Paris. Those of you who are acquainted at all with history have heard of the Bastille. All right. We were among others. Oh, first I must say that in front of us, as we were waiting to be interrogated as to what we were there, was a man. He was French. And while he wasn't rough or anything, but he did talk a lot. And when we went through and came up the stairs to the detention room, we saw him laying spread out on his back in the middle of that broad stairway. And the fellows who were upstairs ahead of us saw what happened, say that as he came up, 2 MPs stepped out with their billies and worked him over. They were experts. His face looked like a raw beefsteak, but he wasn't hurt more than that. And I saw him. I was up on an upper deck and looking down, I saw him on the ship coming back. But by the time I got down where he was, he moved. So I don't know what treatment he went through. But he told us when he recovered and came to join us that he was going to have those MPs killed. He knew some Apaches in Paris, outlaws, that could be hired for work of that kind. I doubt if he had it done. He was thankful to get out alive. Well, oh yes, and as we were marched into the Bastille, at the head of the stairs, there was a Negro soldier, I don't know, because dizzy or something, and fell and struck his hip, his lip, lower lip. It was big as a teacup. And one of the guards spoke to the sergeant in charge and said, "There's a fella here hurt pretty bad, bleeding like a stuck pig. What are we going to do with him?" Oh, the sergeant says, "Let him lay. If he's going to croak, he can croak there as well as anybody else, as well as anywhere else." So you know, it wasn't a place to be playing around. Those boys meant business. We went through to a place called Saint-Dizier. And some of those boys had been around. You know, we carried our rations. And among it was some jam. Also some tomatoes. Now the French liked that jam. Tomatoes they wouldn't touch. So these smart boys took the wrapper off of a can of jam, kept it, and put the wrapper on a can of tomatoes. And kids came to the back of the shed where there was an opening in it, and confiture, jam, French, you know. I had quite a vocabulary. Couldn't make up a sentence, but got by. And sure they had confiture. Here came that camouflaged can. The soldier held one end, the kid held the other end, held out his, I think it was about $1. The soldier grabbed the $1, they both let go of the can. I mean, the boy had the can. And that was why the French, part of the reason the French liked us very much. Did I have another something from them? In Chicago, we were discharged. We got home. We At least I did, and I think all the rest did. And I decided to go to farming on my father's lower 80, which I took up, later married, and we had 4 fine kids. My pride and joy, and once in a while my worry and concern. I want to tell you a little about them. The oldest, Norma Jean, now she with her husband have the Davis Decorating Company, painting and paper hanging. And they have a wonderful reputation for the quality of their work. But they're getting old, over 60. And they're having trouble keeping going. And they don't want to hire any help, because the only satisfactory help that they've been able to get was Laurie Bly, a granddaughter, who is a student, a senior at Western University, Western Illinois University, and a retired school teacher. The next is Kenneth, the oldest son. He stayed with farming and did incredibly well. Owns land in southern Illinois, Missouri, and Florida. And he and his wife have a boy and a girl. The boy is a pillar of a rural Baptist church, and his wife plays the piano for church funerals and other affairs. Oh yes, then is Worry, the younger son, who farms the land we have left and helps the girls look after me. And by the way, they're wonderful. Bring me cooked dishes and everything of that sort. So I get along fine in my little shack where I live by myself, which the girls fixed up out of a tenant house that I had built earlier. And then, last but not least, there's little Carol. I suppose you know Carol. Her husband, Charles Bly, is an architect. He's vice president of a big architectural firm in Peoria. And the Blys have 4 children, 1 son, 3 daughters. The son is an architect also, and is employed by a large firm in Houston, Texas. And now he is with a group of 5 in this grandson, Steve, is now in Saudi Arabia with 5 other men designing a residence to cost $1.5 million for the king of Saudi Arabia. And this company first designed the world's biggest embassy in Saudi Arabia. And of course, this biggest embassy belonged to our Uncle Sam. And from there, they got into this other work. All right. Now you know that family. Oh, and the Blythes have 4 children. I don't know if I told you that or not. The son and 3 daughters. Laurie, who is a senior at the University, Western University at Macomb, and Lisa, who is a senior in high school. And their oldest daughter, Sherry, is the mother of my 2 oldest great-grandchildren, 2 little girls. The youngest one is Brianna, and she's 6 months old, and the older one is Maggie, almost 3 years old. All right, I guess that's it. Now, in our travels in France, we came down the Loire River to Saint Nazaire, where we were to take a boat for the good old USA. Now, this man Rab and I, like most others, we didn't stick to the Army groove. We went out whenever we could, looking for something new and something different. Now this man, Dave Long, my buddy also, he was from Paris, Illinois. And he took me to church service. He saw that I got to church. And see, I appreciate that. He thought I was worth saving. Wonderful. And he gave me some advice. And with it, a real compliment. He said, "Kyle, if you don't be careful how you talk around here, you're going to get yourself killed. Don't you know this is the Army? Why," he said, "you've got a meaner mouth than any woman I know." I appreciate that. He meant that. And well, let it go, that's all.